So, hello everyone. Today we would be discussing the vertebral column. So, this is the continuation of the biomechanics series which we have been recording till now. So, if you could look back into the playlist, it you can see we have a list of all the topics covered specifically from the book Cynthia Norkins, the joint structure and function, the biomechanics. And till now we have been able to cover chapter 1, 2, and 3. So the topic that we are starting today, it would be from the chapter 4, and which is the very first topic, that is the vertebral column. So we would be covering the chapter 4 of it, and today we would be talking about the vertebral column, very basics it would be. So we would be talking about the structure of the vertebral column. We would be talking about the structures, how it is aligned, different parts of the vertebral column. A lot of it you might be knowing already. We would be talking about the curvatures of the spine, the primary curvature, secondary curvature, and why they are called so. Along with that, we would be talking a lot about the different types of typical and atypical vertebrae and different structures of a typical vertebrae, and how there are certain things which are part of the atypical vertebrae which makes them atypical or different from the typical ones. We would be talking about all those things. Along with that, again getting a little bit more detailed into the structure of a vertebra, and then a couple of conditions related to that, and then we would be talking about the chorda equina, and eventually we'll sum up the whole thing talking about the structure of the vertebra again. And by the end of this video we should be able to understand how the structure of a vertebral column is aligned, how it is made. We would be talking about specific features of the vertebrae, how it works, a little bit about how it works. Of course, we would be talking about the functioning of the vertebral column and the vertebrae in detail in the future videos. And then we would be talking about other things you can see on the screen, the intervertebral disc and other things in the upcoming videos. So again, starting from the very first thing, the structure of the vertebral column. So as we all know, the vertebral column, we in simple terms, in layman terms, we call it the backbone. So it is not just a bone, it is a stack of different vertebrae or different bones, one over the other, which eventually makes the whole spine, or we call it the backbone or the vertebral column. So you must be knowing it has different parts: the cervical spine, or the topmost part of the vertebra, the middle section, the thoracic, the lower part, the lumbar, below which we have the sacral part and the coccygeal part. We would be talking about all those things. So in total we have 33 vertebrae. So we can see here we have 33 33 vertebrae. All right, which means that we have, like, if we stack all these structures, each vertebrae one over the other, so in total we have 33 of those. So out of those 33, the top 7 ones are the cervical. Thus we call them the cervical vertebrae, the top 7 ones. Then comes the 12 thoracic vertebrae, so we call it like T1 till T12, the thoracic vertebrae. Likewise, in the cervical we have C1, C2, C3 all the way till C7. Those are the cervical vertebrae. Below the thoracic we have 5 lumbar vertebrae, below which we have a big bone we call the sacrum. Or we can, if we talk about the sub parts of the sacrum, we can say it has fused 5 sacral vertebrae, which eventually makes a whole bone called as the sacrum. And below which we have 4, or sometimes you get to see 5 coccygeal vertebrae as well. So in total it won't be wrong if we say that we have people might have 34 or 33 vertebrae depending upon the coccygeal vertebrae. It might vary from person to person. Mostly we get to see 4 coccygeal, but at times it might be 5 as well. Okay, so here in this, if we zoom in a little bit on this part, here we can see this whole thing. This is the vertebral column, and here from this part all the way till here we have the cervical vertebrae or the cervical spine, and which are 7 of those. Likewise, from like just below the 7th cervical vertebra, we start the thoracic, goes all the way down, and then that makes the thoracic vertebrae, which are 12. Just below that starts the lumbar vertebrae, so which are I'm putting it L for the lumbar vertebrae. 5 of those, L1 till L5. Okay, from L1 till L5, below which we have a complete bone, we call it the sacrum. Or if you look a little bit closer to that, we can see we have 1, 2, 3, 4 and kind of 5. So we have 5 sacral vertebrae which are very much fused. So eventually we can call it a sacrum. It won't be wrong if we call the whole bone as a sacrum, or we can say it's a fusion of 5 different bones, the sacral vertebrae. And just below that you can call it the tailbone, or these 4 or at times 5 coccygeal vertebrae as well, and which eventually makes up the whole spine, and we call it the vertebral column. And eventually we have 33 of those, at times 34, but mostly 33 vertebrae. All right, now coming up to another structure, the intervertebral discs. So of course we know that in between each vertebra mostly we have a disc kind of structure. So if you could look at this one, so this is a disc, this structure, it's a disc, this is a disc. So we have these kind of structures, and you can see the disc starts getting much bigger and much denser as we go down all the way to the lower part of the vertebral column, the lumbar spine. You can see the lumbar intervertebral discs are so much thick and so much stronger as compared to the cervical ones, right? So if we talk about the number of discs that we have in the whole cervical spine, so they are exactly 10 less than the number of vertebrae. So we have 23 intervertebral discs. So we can say we have 33 vertebrae and just 10 less of those 23 intervertebral discs. So in total we can say we have like 6 cervical. So in the cervical spine we can say we have, so this was the cervical spine, right, from here till here. So we can say among those we have 6 cervical intervertebral discs. Likewise in the thoracic spine here we can say we have 12 thoracic intervertebral discs as well, which is pretty easy to remember. We have 12 thoracic vertebrae, likewise we have 12 thoracic intervertebral discs. But when it comes to 7 cervical vertebrae, we only have 6 cervical intervertebral discs. So where did that one intervertebral disc go? We'll talk about that in a bit. But apart from that, talking about 5 lumbar vertebrae, for those we have 5 lumbar intervertebral discs as well. So, and talking about the coccygeal, the four coccygeal bones, there is no scope of any sort of intervertebral disc here among the coccygeal bones, because already the bones are very small and they are mostly stacked one after the other without any gap. So there is no scope of any intervertebral disc here. But definitely we have a lot of intervertebral discs from here till all the way up to the cervical spine, we can say. All right, all the way till here. Okay, now coming back to the fact that why we have only 6 intervertebral discs and 7 of cervical vertebrae. The reason being that there is one missing intervertebral disc. And if you know, it could be it's between the C1 and the C2 structure. So we have the vertebra C1 and we have the vertebra C2. Again, we would be talking in a little bit more detail about the structure of the C1 and the C2 in the upcoming videos. But then if I tell you a little bit about these structures, the C1 vertebra, the cervical 1 vertebra, it's mostly like this. It's a ring kind of a structure. And then if we talk about the C2 vertebra, it's mostly like this, having a very big spinous process. Again, what's a spinous process? Again, we will be talking about that thing in a little bit, but then if I give you a gist of that, the spinous process is a structure at the back of the vertebra. Likewise, we have a couple of structures on each side of the vertebra called as the transverse process. So here we have this one as the transverse process. This is the transverse process. This is the transverse process. And this one, this is the spinous process of the vertebra. All right. Now, if you remember, I mentioned the terms typical vertebrae and atypical vertebrae. What is the difference between typical and atypical vertebrae? As the name suggests, the typical vertebra is the one which kind of follows exactly the rules that is supposed to be followed by a typical vertebra. So a typical structure of a vertebra is supposed to have a spinous process, is supposed to have a couple of transverse processes on the sides, and a vertebral body as well. This kind of structure, that is a vertebral body. Okay, but anything, if any kind of vertebra, if that doesn't follow that kind of typical structure, or if it goes a bit different from that typical rule of being a vertebral structure, a spine, so that those ones we call them as atypical vertebrae. All right, so again, why we are calling C1? So C1, this one, we can call it as atypical vertebra, because this one, it doesn't have any transverse process, it doesn't have any spinous process. It might have a couple of transverse processes, but which is not prominent properly, and forget about the spinous process completely. It is mostly a ring kind of structure. Talking about the C2, it has a very big spinous process, not too much prominent transverse processes, and along with that we have a very big structure over here. So again, if I make a bigger picture of the transverse of the C2 vertebra, this one, it could be something like this, having a vertebral body, having small transverse processes, and a very big spinous process. Along with that, it has a very unique structure which goes like this kind of a structure, which we call as the odontoid process. So here I can put it, it's odontoid process. All right, and this odontoid process, it kind of goes around the ring structure of the C1. So again, the C1 and the C2 not following the typical structure of being a typical vertebrae, and hence they are the atypical vertebrae. All right, now why I talked about all these things, because if you talk about the C1 and the C2, do you think there is any scope of having an intervertebral disc between them? No, because there is an odontoid process, which, if just in case if there was an intervertebral disc over there, the odontoid process would have pierced it. So anyways, there is no scope of having an intervertebral disc between C1 and C2, and that kind of suggests why we have only 6 cervical vertebrae and not 7, because there is one missing between C1 and C2. All right, now again, if we talk a little bit more about the structure and the placement of the intervertebral discs, so here we can talk a little bit about that. So we can mention here, starting from C1, let's say this is C2 vertebra, this is C3 vertebra, C4, C5, C6, C7, and then comes T1, thoracic. Likewise, T2, T3. Okay, so again, as we discussed, there is no scope of any intervertebral disc between C1 and C2. So the very first cervical intervertebral disc, it starts from C2, C3. It is present between C2 and C3. So that's the C1D, I'll name it as in, like, that's the first intervertebral disc between C2 and C3. Likewise, we have C2D, that is the second intervertebral disc between C3 and C4. Likewise comes the third one, likewise the fourth one, okay, fifth one between C6, C7, likewise sixth one between C7 and T1. We need to remember that the last cervical intervertebral disc, it lies between the transitional vertebrae. What I mean by transitional vertebrae, so here we can see from C7 till T1, they are kind of transitioning, they are changing. It's changing from the thoracic one till the cervical one. All right, so okay, now again, coming back to it, here we can see if they are transitioning, if they are changing, so it means that between T1 and T2, it is supposed to be the first first intervertebral disc of the thoracic spine. So the first thoracic intervertebral disc is supposed to be between the T1 and the T2, and that's why it suggests that why we have only 6 intervertebral discs in the cervical spine. Alright, and again, if we continue this thing down all the way till T12 and L1, again the transitional vertebrae, so it is supposed to be having the 12th thoracic intervertebral disc. So the 12th thoracic intervertebral disc would be between T12 and L1. Likewise, if I continue, I'll continue over here. So again, here we have L1 all the way till L5, and then starts the sacrum S1. So again, this is the transitional section of the vertebral column between the lumbar and the sacral. So here, this one, it is supposed to be the 5th lumbar intervertebral disc. So the first one would be between L1 and L2. This one would be the first lumbar intervertebral disc, and likewise the 5th lumbar intervertebral disc would be between L5 and S1. Okay, so that's why we can say we have coming back to the whole thing, we can see we have 5 lumbar intervertebral discs, and the 5th one is between L5 S1. Likewise 12 thoracic intervertebral discs, the 12th one being between T12 and L1, and likewise 6 cervical intervertebral disc, and the one that is absent is between C1 and C2. Okay.